800,000 people. That is the number that haunts modern China. It is a figure found in leaked documents and whispered accounts, nearly 4 times the official death toll released by the government. On July 28, 1976, at 3:42 in the morning, the industrial city of Tangshan ceased to exist. 1 million people were sleeping in unreinforced brick homes when the ground liquefied beneath them. But the tragedy was not just the falling buildings, it was the wall of silence built around them. In the dying days of the Cultural Revolution, admitting a disaster of this scale was seen as political weakness. So, as a city lay flattened, the leadership prioritized ideology over rescue. To understand how a modern metropolis can vanish in seconds and how a government can hide nearly 1 million bodies, we have to look at the ground itself. The danger was hiding in plain sight. Directly beneath the city's foundations lay the Tangshan Fengnan fault system. For decades, local planners and engineers believed this fault was inactive, a sleeping giant that would not wake. They built a city of heavy industry on top of a loaded gun. In the days leading up to the catastrophe, the Earth tried to warn them. Local scientists tracked anomalies that defied explanation. Wells in nearby villages spiked and fell rhythmically, like the Earth was breathing. Strange, multicolored lights flashed across the horizon, a phenomenon known as earthquake lights, caused by the ionization of air from stressed rock. Rats fled the sewers in broad daylight. Fish leaped from ponds. But in 1976, communication channels were clogged with political slogans, not scientific data. These warnings were localized, fragmented, and ignored. Then, the tension snapped. At 3:42 in the morning, the fault ruptured. It was a magnitude 7.8 earthquake, but the number does not tell the whole story. The hypocenter was incredibly shallow, just 11 kilometers down. This meant the energy did not have time to dissipate before hitting the surface. The ground acceleration was violent enough to throw people into the air. Seismologists classify the shaking as intensity 11 on the Mercalli scale. This is defined as extreme. It means rails are bent, underground pipes are destroyed, and few, if any, masonry structures remain standing. Tangshan was an unreinforced city. 85% of the residential buildings were simple masonry structures, brick held together with weak mortar designed to withstand wind, not violent shearing of the earth. When the shockwave hit, the soil underwent liquefaction, turning solid ground into quicksand. Buildings did not just crack, they folded. Engineers call it pancake collapse. The walls blew out, and the concrete floors stacked on top of each other instantly. There were no survival voids, no triangles of life. Just layers of concrete crushing everything between them. Hospitals collapsed with doctors and patients inside. Schools, factories, and apartment blocks were leveled in less than half a minute. The destruction was total. In 23 seconds, a region the size of Los Angeles was paralyzed. Bridges twisted like ribbons. Railroad tracks snapped. But the cruelest irony happened underground. 10,000 coal miners were working the night shift deep beneath the city. Because seismic waves lose intensity at depth, the miners barely felt the shake. They survived the quake, only to climb back to the surface and find their world gone. Their homes were piles of rubble. Their families were buried. As they emerged from the pits, they walked into a moonscape. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound of a city that had lost its voice. And as the dust settled over the ruins, the rest of the world heard nothing. 100 miles to the west, the shock waves rattled the windows of Beijing. The massive chandeliers in the Great Hall of the People swung violently, waking the political leadership from their sleep. But in 1976, China was paralyzed by a different kind of tremor. Chairman Mao Zedong was dying, and the Gang of Four, a radical political faction, was tightening its grip on power. To them, a natural disaster was not a humanitarian crisis. It was a political threat. Acknowledging the scale of the devastation would suggest the government had lost the mandate of heaven, a traditional concept legitimizing the ruler. So they chose to erase the disaster. While seismographs around the world registered the magnitude 7.8 event, the Chinese state media went dark. There were no breaking news alerts, no images of the ruins, and no calls for help. Instead, the front pages of the People's Daily remained filled with attacks on political rivals. The government imposed a total media blackout. Foreign journalists were barred from the region, and the airspace was closed. When the United Nations, the United States, Britain, and Japan offered emergency aid, teams of rescue dogs, and heavy lifting equipment, Beijing rejected them all. The official stance was self-reliance. The regime declared that the Chinese people would conquer nature with revolutionary spirit alone, dismissing foreign help as sugar-coated bullets meant to sabotage the nation. This decision sealed the fate of tens of thousands of people trapped in the rubble. Without heavy hydraulic jacks or cranes, survivors were forced to dig through concrete slabs with their bare hands. Inside the disaster zone, the reality was apocalyptic, but the propaganda machine began churning out a different story. They broadcast slogans like "Deepen the criticism of Deng Xiaoping," "Perform anti-Quake relief work." The press published stories of citizens reciting political theory to survive pain and hunger, claiming that ideological purity was stronger than starvation. It was a surreal theater of ideology performed on top of a graveyard. To ensure the secret was kept, the military did not just mobilize for rescue, they mobilized for containment. A rigid cordon was established around Tangshan. The few roads that were passable were guarded by soldiers with orders to restrict movement. Refugees were prevented from fleeing, effectively trapping the injured in a city with no water, no electricity, and no hospitals. The blockade was not to keep looters out, it was to keep the truth in. It took days for a radio broadcast to finally address the nation. When it did, it was vague. It praised the victory of the party in the face of difficulty, but gave no death toll, no casualty count, and no images of the destruction. For the rest of China, Tangshan was simply a struggle to be overcome. For the people inside, it was hell. The silence lasted for 3 years. It was not until 1979, after the political winds had shifted and the Gang of Four had been deposed, that the state news agency finally released a number. They claimed 242,769 people had died. It was a staggering figure, double the toll of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Yet almost immediately, whispers began that this number was a fabrication. It was too precise, too clean, and suspiciously low given the population density and the total collapse of the housing stock. The true scale of the loss likely lies in the documents that were never meant to be seen. A report from the Hebei Revolutionary Committee, compiled in the chaos of the immediate aftermath and later leaked, estimated the death toll at 655,000. Other analyses, taking into account the immediate deaths and those who died from injury and starvation in the weeks that followed, pushed the estimate as high as 800,000. Why is the discrepancy so massive? The answer lies in who the government considered a resident. The official count largely tracked registered citizens with an urban hukou or residency permit. It ignored the temporary migrant workers who flooded the industrial city. It ignored the unregistered rural population living on the periphery. It ignored the missing, who were simply wiped from the records as if they had moved away. In the eyes of the bureaucracy, if you were not registered, you did not die. The survivors who pulled their neighbors from the wreckage tell a story that aligns with the higher numbers. They describe a silence that fell over entire districts because there was no one left to scream. They speak of paraplegic villages, sanatoriums built in the aftermath to house the thousands of people left paralyzed by crushing spinal injuries. These facilities became living monuments to the lack of medical equipment and the refusal of foreign aid. The rescue effort was defined by raw human desperation rather than technical coordination. Without the rejected international aid, soldiers arrived with nothing but shovels and iron bars. They pried at multi-ton concrete slabs until their fingers bled, often listening to voices fade away beneath the ruins because they physically could not lift the weight. It was a rescue by manpower in an age of machines. The Tangshan earthquake eventually became a pivot point. Decades later, when the 2008 Sichuan earthquake struck, the response was different. Media access was granted and international aid was accepted. But that transparency was bought with the lives of the people in Tangshan. Their deaths were the lesson that forced a superpower to realize that geology does not care about ideology. The city was eventually rebuilt, rising from the dust, as a modern grid of steel and glass. But beneath the new foundations, the soil is still thick with the memory of those who were never counted. Tangshan remains a dual tragedy. The first was the geological violence of the fault line, which no government could have prevented. The second was the political negligence that followed, which was entirely a choice. Whether the true number is 240,000 or 800,000, the lesson remains the same. Secrecy in the face of disaster is lethal. The earth will always move, but we decide how many survive the aftermath. If you want to see more investigations into the history they tried to hide, click subscribe.